Welcome to the Thalberg Foundation podcast series New Thinking for a New World. Host Alan Stoga welcomes leaders from around the world to explore the issues that are challenging and changing their societies. From climate change to democracy under siege to geopolitics and beyond, we are looking for ideas that can make all our lives better.
My guest today is David Andelman, a storied American diplomatic correspondent and author who has reported on most of the conflicts that have shaped our modern era. His most recent book is A Red Line in the Sand: Diplomacy, Strategy, and the History of Wars That Still Might Happen. Welcome, David, and congratulations on the book.
Well, thank you. It's good to be with you.
You have written a deep analysis of all of the danger spots around the world, particularly from an American perspective. It should be required reading for President Biden and his new security team. And I think we would both celebrate that our incoming administration apparently does actually read books.
Well, actually, in fact, that's interesting. One of those members of the security team, and I don't like to tell tales out of school, but one of them did tell me that he had ordered it from Amazon. And I said, well, if you enjoy it, you should maybe pass it on up on the line to your boss. So we'll see.
Well, I would argue if he enjoys it, he should not only pass it along, but he should think about what to do with it. And that's where I'd like to start. If you were briefing the new president, what would you tell him are the 2 or 3 most dangerous hotspots? And what should he do about them? Where should President Biden start?
Well, one of the themes of my book is that there are more red lines right now, more lines between countries, between ideologies, between peoples and so on, than have ever really existed at any single time in history. And that was my mission in writing this book, was to explore how these came about, where they're likely to be going, and so on. We all know what the major hotspots are. You know, it's China in the South China Sea, and Korea and North Korea and the atomic bomb. It's Iran and their quest for a nuclear weapon. It's various issues in Mesopotamia, Iraq and Syria. All across Africa, there are a host of red lines that mostly delineate where terrorists have begun to pop up, some of them refugees from the Middle East and so on. And of course, then there are the red lines between East and West, Russia and Western Europe and America. And there are red lines within Europe as well. So we've looked at all of these. I think that President Biden's principle, he has several principal issues he needs to deal with first. And his first day, apparently, we already know he's going to put the U.S. back in the Paris Climate Accord, which is great. He's going to re-enter us in the World Health Organization, which is great. But basically, above all, he has to make sure that our allies understand that we are back in the world, that we want to take down the red lines that the Trump administration years before that had established, either in an ill-considered or actually malignant fashion. And we need to be back in the game, as it were, and that we're reliable and that we're constant. And that frankly is one of the key themes in my book, that a red line, if it's going to work effectively, and some have worked very effectively, both sides need to understand what they're all about, how they began, what their purpose is, and are committed to making them work. And that's what Biden is going to have to do, I think.
You talk in the book, and you've just mentioned this explosion of red lines with countries challenging each other not to do this or to do that, or don't you dare cross. It's almost like a cartoon of the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. But I wonder if that explosion is telling us something about the underlying breakdown of global order, the erosion of the dominance of the United States. How worried are you that we can't get back to something?
Well, we always have to go forward. I mean, that's look at sharks. If they don't continue moving forward and they stop eating, they die. The world will die if it doesn't move forward in some fashion. The goal is to have it move forward in a constructive fashion and without being constrained by any of these lines that have been put up in the past for any one of a host of reasons. So that we really need to have a sense of what is going to work in the future in terms of our relations, America's relations with the world, but also the world's relations with each other in any given region. What is the relationship between Iran and Iraq, between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and so on? What is the relationship between Israel and its neighbors? And it's interesting because if you go back in many of these areas, I go back in some cases 1,000 years, 2,000 years to find red lines that really exist today that really had their roots in greatly historic issues between all of the peoples of the world of that particular region and beyond. So it's interesting. It's not only an issue that's grown up recently. Some of these have roots very, very deeply in the past. But we need to understand that, and we need to master all of that if we're going to go forward and figure a way of either working with these red lines or dismantling them.
You talk in the book a lot about the Middle East in both historical context and in recent history. And then, of course, we have this most recent chapter of the so-called Abraham Accords, which may or may not have changed everything. So we go back to an old Sunni Shia fight, but now it is the Persians, the Iranians, the Shia on one side, and the Arabs, and of all people, the Israelis on the other side. So that evolution of who's where, of what red lines matter, of what are the challenges, is a dramatic departure, it seems. How are you thinking about the Abraham Accords?
I kind of like them in principle. I think it's great if all of these countries can begin to understand the values that they have of working together rather than at cross purposes, and certainly the Israelis understand the value of getting along with their neighbors in some fashion. But there are certain underpinnings of the Abraham Accords that trouble me a little bit. One of the principal elements of it that trouble me is this need for Israel to exercise some degree of restraint in basically continuing to creep forward into Palestinian territory and continue to seize more land and seize more villages for their own and so on. This was one of the fundamentals of the Abraham Accords, and this was the reason why all of these other countries that have signed on to them and open diplomatic relations and trade and whatever, and especially tourism, by the way, I might add that tourism was a very important element of all of these things, purely materialistic. But the reason that they were able to do that is because they have this pledge from Israel not to continue to usurp Palestinian lands. Well, that already seems to be a little bit problematic, since we already do have reports of 80 houses seized there and a village seized there and whatever, and basically, shall we say, creeping dissolution. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but creeping dissolution of the agreement as the underpinnings of the agreement. So what I've said from the beginning, especially since I finished writing the book, and especially the final chapter, which deals specifically with Israel and the Abraham Accords in some of those areas. And in fact, I ran a full page map of the Abraham Accords that Jared Kushner drafted and is in that document. I ran that in this book to show exactly what the stakes are. But basically, what we have to make sure of is that Israel understands the stakes involved and are prepared to go along with it. Now, with the Israeli election coming along pretty quickly, I don't know. I mean, Netanyahu has painted himself into a corner. Other people have painted themselves into corners. And I'm not sure that they have the forbearance to be able to, understand they need to simply restrain themselves, at least for a while. Because if that doesn't happen, then it's never going to go any further. And by the way, they also have to find a way. And I think if anybody can do this, Biden and Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, respectively, the Secretary of State designate and the National Security Advisor designate, if any of them can get the Palestinians to come in and at least talk, they can. But after the U.S. moved the embassy to Jerusalem, the Palestinians said that we're out. We don't have anything to do with this. But I think that there are ways of getting them to the table also. All of these are necessary if these accords are going to work, and if all of this web of red lines in that whole region are going to begin to fade away into pink or rose, or begin fading away entirely, which I devoutly hope will happen.
Let me push you on that only in this regard. I sense a bit of a nod and a wink between the Arabs and the Israelis over the Palestinians, that there are issues now, perhaps, that are more important to a number of the Arab states. I wonder if the Palestinians, like the Kurds, whom you talk about in the book as well, like other peoples, the Rohingya, haven't had their place as losers in the great game cemented by this most recent accord.
Maybe, I mean, the world can see that these lands are being taken and seized and whatever, and the more that becomes clear that the Israelis are not going to respect that very important underpinning of the Abraham Accords. I think the less likely it is that all of these other things will bear any fruit at all. I mean, those things could have, trade and technology and all of that stuff, they could have been important 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, but and to have them actually come bear fruit, they haven't borne fruit yet. I mean, hopefully they will. But I think if the Palestinians are left hanging out to dry in the end, that's going to make it a very steep hill to climb, I think, frankly. But we'll see. I mean, I hope for the best.
Let's shift slightly north to Iran. And again, you write at length about the situation in Iran, the evolution of that history over years, good, bad, and ugly. If you were sitting in Tehran today watching the United States cope with its domestic internal issues, segue from a one particular kind of administration, whatever adjectives we might use, to one that looks more familiar, to listening to both loud and quiet requests to reinvigorate, reimagine, rejoin the nuclear deal, to make that work again. If you were sitting in Tehran, how do you think you would make your calculus?
Well, first of all, when we say Tehran, this is not a homogeneous organization by any means.
On its good days.
Right, exactly, on its good days, exactly. But look, you have a spectrum at least as fraught and complex as you have in Israel, where there are like 20 parties in the Knesset and 25 others trying to get into the Knesset, the parliament. So, but you have equally as many factions in Iran. You have on the one extreme, you have a lot of very liberal people, including a lot of the Bazaris, the people who run small merchants and whatever, who really are the backbone of the Iranian economy. On one extent, who want really a greater opening to the West, more markets, more, certainly an end to sanctions and so on, all the way across through the spectrum of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, the militant conservatives, all the way to the more extreme ayatollahs. And again, the ranks of the senior ayatollahs are not at any rate, at any degree, homogeneous, although among the more conservative, unfortunately, is the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. So the question then is, so who is in charge and who's calling the shots in Iran? I don't think anybody really knows that. But I think right now, unless, and Biden's is going to it's going to be tough. And frankly, I wrote this in a commentary that should be publishing maybe even by the time this is out on the air for CNN, saying that basically Biden is going to have to figure a way of threading his way between all the different factions there and helping understand he cannot lift the sanctions immediately. He's not going to lift them immediately. On the other hand, the Iranians have to make sure that they're making some kind of concessions. And frankly, I think to a degree they are. We got past the actual a critical anniversary just last week when a year ago President Trump ordered the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, the head of an important portion of the Revolutionary Guard forces. And he was really a hero. He was a martyr in many respects, but a hero, and to so many people across all the spectrum in Iran. When Trump ordered that execution, that was just horrible. I mean, that was a huge event. If the Iranians hadn't screwed it up by accidentally shooting down a passenger plane, which was complete idiocy, but they would have been in a good position to have retaliated dramatically against us. As it is, a year from now, everybody was expecting this is when they're going to really retaliate. They didn't. So the question now is, if I was sitting in Iran, am I saying to myself, maybe they actually are waiting to see if we can do some kind of a deal with the West, we come back into this treaty. So on the one hand, we've said we are going to increase our uranium stockpile to 20% concentration, which is another step towards a bomb. But on the other hand, we haven't expelled all of the nuclear inspectors yet. And we haven't attacked American or Western forces in Iraq or any place because of Soleimani. So I would say that there's a chance that this could work. that returning to this in some fashion to this treaty or renegotiating this treaty could work. And I hope it can.
It would certainly take away one of the greater risks, war in the Middle East, or at least that kind of confrontation in the Middle East. But maybe the reddest of red lines going forward, or the one that needs the most tension, is the relationship between the United States and China. You alluded earlier to the South China Sea, where the Chinese have aggressively been literally filling in the red line with sand and gravel and islands. We've had no end of bumps, not just during the last 4 years, during the last 8, 12 years, as the two great powers, one legacy, one emerging, seem to try to figure out what kind of world they want, how they want to relate to each other. Impossible question, but I'll ask it anyhow. What would you anticipate the next chapters of that relationship might look like?
Well, I think, first of all, I think we have a couple of people at the top, like Blinken and his deputy, Wendy Sherman, and Jake Sullivan in the White House on the NSC. I think that they really understand what China really wants. What China really wants is to be accepted and acknowledged as a great power. And it's that simple. They want the respect that they believe they are entitled to as potentially the second most, the largest economy in the world. In fact, it looks like, for a whole host of reasons, the only major economy in the world in 2020 that will actually have been expanding rather than contracting. The numbers we saw the other day were over 2% expansion. Everybody else is going to be contracting. But they want to be respected, and that's not that hard to do. I mean, we should respect them, and this is something that I don't think they ever really got from the United States under Trump. I mean, Trump could say, "Oh, she and I got along great, and whatever. We played golf, or I took him to a golf course. If he didn't play golf, he played golf, I guess, with the Japanese prime minister. But at least understand that there is a person at the top or people at the top who understand what they want, what they need, and there's got to be some kind of a condominium, but." I have to say that with the corollary to that is, of course, that this means that China will continue to build its military forces dramatically. And this is something I explore in great detail in this book. I think China wants and expects it can get very quickly a blue water navy, which it has never had before. It is already establishing a series of military bases, they call it the String of Pearls, around the Indian Ocean over towards the Middle East and Africa. Military bases along that periphery, which will expand their front yard, if you will, from just the South China Sea, which they have now basically secured almost entirely, to other parts of the world. And eventually they're building aircraft carriers. But also, and this is interesting because I had a long conversation last week with Michelle Flournoy, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense under Obama. And she says to me, not only are they building their own Navy, but they're developing missile systems that can take out a lot of our forces, our aircraft carriers, in the first 30 minutes of any war. But both she and I agree that China doesn't want a war. That's the last thing they want. They want to be prosperous. They want to rule the world economically and in all those fashions. So they want a recognition that they have the right to compete in that fashion, some fashion, and in some way become a major power and perceived as a major power in every respect.
I had the opportunity 6 years ago to listen to a very senior Chinese official lecture a very senior American official on the Monroe Doctrine. And his point was he said, as you declared and enforced the Monroe Doctrine to push the Europeans out of the Americas, we think that our Caribbean is the South and East China Seas, and that under the flag of Asia for the Asians, we intend to dominate that space. What is the United States going to be able to do in Asia? What do the Chinese want to do in other parts of the world? How do we get to that shared recognition between the Chinese and the Americans of what those lines might be, of who gets to draw the lines and where the most important risks might be?
Well, we did have a lot of friends in Asia, and in fact, we still do, I think. All of the periphery of the South China Sea, all of the ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries, Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, that whole Singapore, Indonesia, that whole periphery used to be really our kind of people, our people. And in fact, when we were negotiating a trade pact that would have included all of them, that would have been a very good way of isolating China or neutralizing it in many respects. But now, Trump, the first thing he did is he came in and he blew up that whole Asian accord that would have been a wonderful trade agreement that would have been a landmark agreement and would have cemented those countries' loyalty to us, at the same time deprived China of a lot of the trade and economic advantages of the kind of agreement that they finally did conclude when we pulled out. And so they may be trying to steal these people's islands, islands that are claimed by Vietnam and the Philippines and Malaysia and so on. But they're also, at the same time, helping these countries as well and trading with them and allowing them to establish and open factories that will trade with China and so forth. So this is something that we need to get over. We need to get back to the position of some kind of a leadership role in that part of the world and an understanding of just how important that is to us and to them.
Let me segue out of the physical world into the cyber world. When people think of red lines, as your book title, they think of lines in the sand, and there's all of the historic lines that were literally drawn in the sand at various points. But cyber changes everything. How do we think about red lines in cyberspace? The same way as in the physical world, or is there something different? Is there a different approach needed?
Oh, no, I think in many respects it's exactly the same approach. There was only one real violation. I mean, apart from our elections and all that sort of thing, what Russia's been doing, there was really been only one major cyber attack in the classic wartime sense. And that was a few years ago in Estonia. When Russia staged an outright full-scale cyber attack on Estonia. And it really did take down the entire economy and society of that country for about a week until they were finally able to neutralize and defeat it. And the Russians pulled back for a whole host of reasons. And Estonia is a NATO country. So it could have become a NATO issue as well. The NATO, Article 5 of the NATO treaty says, an attack on one is an attack on all. And in theory, all of NATO could have retaliated on Russia, but it didn't happen that way. And Estonian prime minister told me around shortly after that time was because nobody actually died in that war, but people could have. And that would be the criterion, I think, in the future. So cyber warfare is every bit as important. It's just another tool in the warfare toolbox, if you will. But the underlying red lines that either it supports or it defends or it establishes really haven't changed that much in that respect. Diplomacy is still important. Warfighting capability is important. Strategy is desperately important. So we need to pay attention to all of this. We need to really develop our cyber capabilities.
Article 5 wasn't invoked because no one died. Of course, by the time somebody dies in the cyber world, the war is probably over as part of the problem, don't you think?
Well, it is, or it's just going to the next stage. I don't know. I mean, look, it's never happened, so no one can really say exactly how it could happen. I'm sure there are people at Rand Corporation or someone who are doing war games on precisely the subject just as we speak. But sure, look, the Russians have tremendous capability. So do we, and we've demonstrated that in the past. Maybe they need a good demonstration. The Iranians demonstrated that when we basically took down a lot of their enrichment operations by a cyber attack. So, we do have that capability. The Chinese have that capability. A lot of other NATO countries have that capability. The Russians certainly do. Probably the North Koreans have that as well. So, sure, it's another form of warfare that is insidious and into which red lines are already drawn in many respects, and which are used in many ways to build on and reinforce the existing red lines that would be ordinarily defended maybe by nuclear means or some other deterrent situations.
Final question. Clearly, and you've said it several different ways, the last 4 years of the presidency of Donald Trump has not improved the position of the United States in the world, quite the opposite. But quite frequently at the start of an administration, and we've seen this through history a number of times, our opponents like to try to take our medal, take our measure by challenging the United States here or there or somewhere else. And we saw it when President Kennedy was in office. We've seen it. We saw it when Nixon was in office, and so on, coming into office. Do you think we have the conditions under which we should expect such a challenge? And if so, where? Impossible question again. Where would it come from, do you think?
Oh, I think it could come from. I think that absolutely will. I think it could come from anywhere. I think it's already started in many respects. I think when the Russians seized Alexei Navalny, Putin's opponent, when he came back on Sunday from the 17th, from January 17th, from Berlin to Moscow, they seized him at the airport. That was a direct, clear signal to the United States and the West. We don't care. We're going to do anything we feel like doing if it's important to us. And immediately some of the Biden people were outraged by this, and they should be. So if Russia's going to be willing to come back if we're going to be able to get back to the table with Russia, they've got to understand that ball is in their court now to play ball with us and to at least give us something back. And I think all of these countries need to understand it's time that they understand that a red line cuts two ways. And we can establish them and we can enforce them just as well as they can. And we will watch how they respect our lines that are important to us. And they should watch that, because if they want to have any kind of a decent relationship with us, and it will be worth it in the long run, especially as long as Biden and his or his successors are in charge, then I think that they really need to understand that they need to go at least halfway, if not more than halfway, to meet our needs as we will try to meet theirs.
But certainly the Navalny case, the Hong Kong case, the signing of the European Union-China investment accord, despite a public plea from the incoming administration to delay it until they had a chance to begin a conversation. You have the sense that maybe people don't want better relationships with the United States, or feel that we are so weakened that they can push on those red lines, constrain us a little bit more, and better to do it right from the start.
No, I think that the greatest fear, and I've talked to a lot of European diplomats, especially very high-level French diplomats in the last 10 days, 2 weeks, is they're concerned that, in fact, Biden and company are simply an interregnum and not a return to normalcy. That, in fact, the real tendency of the United States had been expressed by Trump and his colleagues, his friends, rather than what Biden is bringing back to the table. That Biden issue is only simply a very brief respite, and then we're back to where we really had intended to be. We have to show the Europeans, and it may take 4 years, hopefully only take a couple of years or maybe less. But if we can assure them that the United States is not simply leveled out in a long downward spiral, but has in fact reversed that spiral and is trying to spiral back up towards the surface, that is the only way we are ever going to become a major power again in the world, I think.
And that is the fundamental challenge facing this government, and indeed all of us who want to see the United States play a significant global role. Thank you very much for that. And again, I want to thank you. I enjoyed reading the book, Red Lines, A Red Line in the Sand, Diplomacy, Strategy, and the History of Wars That Still Might Happen. Let's hope those wars that still might happen don't happen anytime soon. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New Thinking for a New World podcast. We welcome your comments on our website, talbergfoundation.org, and please subscribe to the podcast in the app of your choice. This podcast was made possible with the generous support of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation.